Good evening. This is Pastor Barbara, aka Preacher with Parrots, aka Barbara Shelton. Um, Today is the 27th of September 2017. It's Wednesday night, so we have a live group. It's also, because it's Wednesday night, we're in the Old Testament. We have just finished the book of Numbers, and we are beginning the book of Deuteronomy. In Numbers, we finished pretty much the activities of the 38 to 40 years that they wandered around, that Israel wandered around in the desert, finishing off the years in which the people who had voted not to cross into Kadesh Barnea, not to go into the promised land at that time, their punishment was that they would die off and they never would go in, because the punishment was 1 year for 1 day. They were in the promised land. That was 40 days, so that meant 40 years. So that meant that everybody that was 60 years old had to die. The people who voted were 21 or over. So we had kids who were 20 or younger, and they were 40 years wandering around, so they were 60 years or close to it, and they could go in. Deuteronomy kind of finishes up the book of Numbers and then does a couple of things. In Deuteronomy, Moses reminds the people of their history. And that's probably what we're going to do tonight. It'll probably take us that long to do the first 3 chapters. After that, beginning with the 4th chapter, we have Moses, who knows he's going to die before, and he's not going to go into the promised land. In tonight's lesson, he's going to ask if he can go. But he's already been told he can't. And it won't be granted to him. But he is now reminding those who were children to 20 years, who then later grew up and became 60 years old, wandering around in the wilderness. He is reminding them of the law. We had some of the law in Exodus and in Leviticus and in Numbers. But in Deuteronomy, we kind of have another group. Also in Deuteronomy, besides reminding them of their history and reminding them of the law and of everything God has done for them and expects of them, we then go through the various places that they go, getting ready to cross over. There are some places we'll read that God does not give to them because he's given them to somebody else. Esau was one. You know, Esau was the firstborn, and Jacob tricked him and stole his birthright. So Esau would have been an important person, but he wasn't. But he was given certain land. Now, he's dead. He's been dead. But we're talking about land that is given to his and to his offspring. The same is true of Lot. Lot is a big person. He's Abraham's nephew in the book of Genesis. and there is certain territory that's given to them. And then there's territory that's given to others. We're going to find out when we get into Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and so forth, that some of these people that were given land, well, not directly to them, but to their descendants, became almost lifelong or forever long enemies of Israel. Moab being one, Edom being another, and so forth. But let's get on now with the book of Deuteronomy. I'm reading this evening from the Holden Standard Bible. These are the words Moses spoke to all Israel across the Jordan in the wilderness. Whenever it's across the Jordan in the Bible, it means outside of Israel. The border, the western border for Israel, is the Mediterranean Sea. The eastern border for Israel, as we know it, is the Jordan River. It starts in the north, where there's mountains and snow, becomes a river, goes into the Sea of Galilee, which is not a sea, it's a lake. The difference being that it's fresh water, not salt water. Continues on as a river till it gets to the Dead Sea, and it ends in the Dead Sea. But there's an imaginary line that goes down the middle of the Dead Sea. And the western part of the Dead Sea belongs to Israel. And the eastern part belongs to whatever country is east of them. Biblical times, Moab, Edom, and so forth. Modern times, Jordan, Syria, etc. So Moses is speaking to all the people across the Jordan, meaning not in what we consider Israel or the Promised Land. They haven't gotten there yet. I wouldn't have used the words across Jordan because they haven't crossed it yet. And these words are not being spoken from what we consider the Promised Land or Israel. Nevertheless, that's what it means. It gives a description of many places that I'm not going to read to you. It's in verse 2, it's an 11-day journey from Horeb, Mount Horeb, to Kadesh Barnea by way of Mount Seir. Mount Seir, future history will tell us, was also an enemy of Israel in its early days. So it was an 11-day journey from Mount Horeb to Kadesh Barnea if you went by way of Mount Seir. They had to go on the outside of what is Israel because they had not yet crossed over. Kadesh Barnea, or some say Kadesh Barnea. You know, there's only one way of saying it in Spanish, so I have problems sometimes with the English. That was the border town that they were supposed to cross into the Promised Land. And that's where they balked, refused, voted, and because of that vote, wandered around for 40 years. And everybody that had voted, which was everybody above 21 years old, had to die off because those 40 years had to go by. So it's an 11-day journey from Mount Horeb to Kadesh Barnea by way of Mount Seir. In the 40th year and the 11th month, on the first of the month, Moses told the Israelites everything the Lord commanded him to tell them. And I see that we're being featured. And those that are watching us, by virtue of the fact that they're on page 1, do not have access to our chat box. And you don't know what in the world I'm talking about since you just started. Larry, would you fix the chat box as you do when I start teaching? Thank you. We don't have chat when I'm teaching. As soon as I finish teaching, we'll remove that and there'll be chat for whoever wants to chat. All right. We're in the book of Deuteronomy. Most of the 40 years that Israel wandered in the wilderness is about to be completed. In the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, the first 3 chapters, which is probably what we're going to limit our study to tonight, Moses tells these people, because they were 20 years old and younger when this vote of not going into the promised land in Kadesh Barnea was taken. They were young, so Moses, and they've been traveling around, Moses reminds them of the history of their nation, and especially the history of the last 4 years. Following that, because their lives have been 4 years wandering around, Moses reminds them of the 10 Commandments, and we're going to have them written out again in Deuteronomy, just like we had them written out when they were first given. And he reminds them of a lot of other things, some of which we have not seen before. And then the book ends with his blessing. Each patriarch, when he died, he knew he was dying. And he would call his children around them and give them an individual blessing. And so we have Moses' blessing on all of the people. And then at the very end of this book, Moses dies. The next book is Joshua. Joshua is the one who will take Moses' place as the leader of the Israelis. And he will be the one that will get them across the Jordan River, which, by the way, is going to be very similar to their ancestors crossing the Red Sea. The Jordan River is going to open up for them. Of course, the Jordan River, I could throw well, I can't now. I got a problem with my shoulder. But 5 years ago, I could have thrown a stone from one side of the Jordan to the other. And you certainly can't do that with the Red Sea. But it's similar. The waters do open. So that's where we are. So now it's an 11-day journey for them to go to Mount Seir. All of these countries which surround what we call the Promised Land or Israel have been given by God to somebody else. One area was given to, not to Lot because he's been dead, Abraham's nephew, but to his descendants. And others to the descendants of Esau, Jacob and Esau, and so forth. We're going to read in these first couple of chapters where they're told, be nice to these people. I'm not going to give you their land because they're giving it to somebody else, but be nice to them. Don't hassle them. In some cases, God will tell them, no, I'm giving you this land. Do away with them. All right. This was after he had defeated the king of the Amorites who lived uh, and Og, the king of Bashan. Bashan is one of those places east. It is north of where Jordan is now, but that's where it is. Across the Jordan in the land of Moab, Moses began explaining the law, and this is what he said in verse 6. The Lord our God spoke to us at Horeb and says, you've stayed on this mountain long enough. The time has come to move on. Resume your journey and go to the hill country of the Amorites and their neighbors in the lowlands by the seacoast. That would be on the western side by the Mediterranean Sea. To the land of the Canaanites and to Lebanon as far as the Euphrates River. I'm going to show you some maps I have on my cell phone. I don't have an iPad big enough to do justice to showing you these maps. But I want to show you something. This is not the first time that we read in the Bible that the land that God gave the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which we now call Jews or Israelis. This is not the first time we read that the land that God gave them is not the land they possess. But we have a repetition of what we've read before. And I lost my place. Here we go. Verse 7. To the land of the Canaanites and to Lebanon. Lebanon was Lebanon then, and it still is. Syria was Syria then, and it still is. Some of these countries have changed names or the geography. If you're standing, 2,000 years ago someplace, it may have been called Moab, and now it may be called Jordan. The land was to go to Lebanon as far as the Euphrates River. Now let me find my cell phone. This won't be as good as I would like to present to you, but I guess better than nothing. I want to show you first where the Euphrates River is. I remember in the 4th grade, because they taught us that this is where civilization began. And I remember being taught about the Tigris and the Euphrates River. I have both of them on this map I'm going to show you. But the Euphrates River is a large blue line. I want to see how this comes up on the screen. Okay. You see at the bottom where it says Iraq? And you see on the right, on the left, about 2/3 of the way up, you see Turkey. If I had this on something bigger, I could point out to you where Israel is. Israel on this map is less than half an inch wide and long, and probably an eighth of an inch wide. They were given the land all the way to the Euphrates River. See beneath it where it says Syria? The Euphrates River runs through Syria. It runs through Arabia. It runs through halfway through Iraq. The directions that the people were given was first they would cross the Jordan River, go into the land of Canaan. Every place that God said he gave them, they had to walk on it. I remember years ago, a church wanted to buy a certain property to build a bigger church. And there was some kind of a, I don't know whether they were asking too much for it or they had difficulty getting a loan. I don't really know what the problem was. But they came back to this Old Testament Bible story where God told the offsprings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all the land you walk on, I will give you. And I remember a lot of people from the congregation went out to this lot they wanted to buy. I wasn't part of it. I only knew about it. And they walked all over it. I don't even remember the outcome. But they claimed this particular scripture, that if they walked on the land, it would be theirs. There were two things they had to do to make it their land. Of course, first they had to cross the Jordan River and get over to the first part of the land they were supposed to inhabit, which turns out it's the only part they did, which was Canaan. They had to walk on the land and then they had to possess it. They were told, you will live in houses you didn't build. You will drink water from wells that you didn't dig. Meaning you were going to go to a place that already has, and they started out right away eating food that was growing. They crossed the river, and remember, they'd been eating manna for 40 years. They crossed the river. They had sort of like a revival meeting because they had a review of the law again. All the males that weren't circumcised because they'd been camping out in the wilderness for 40 years, they were circumcised. When everything was as it should be, the manna quit coming and they started eating the fruit of the land. But everything was there. It was a matter of their going in. The other people could leave. They could be killed off in a war, whatever. Each situation was different. But they were to walk on the land and then they were to possess it. When we get into the book of Joshua, we're going to read some of the problems they had. And one group of people that totally messed with Joshua's head and convinced him they were somebody else and got a promise that they could live there. We'll get to that when we get there. The thing of it is, I didn't know until recently how much land God gave them that number one, they didn't walk on, and number two, they didn't possess. Let's see if I have another map here. On this map, it doesn't show what I want it to show. but let me show it to you anyway, since it's all I have. That dark red part is Iran. We're not interested in that. But to the left of it is Iraq. Okay. If you look at the Persian Gulf, which is blue, you see Kuwait. The Euphrates River runs through Kuwait, Iraq, Syria. It includes Jordan. It goes up even into Turkey. You look on it on the map, and if I had it on something bigger and I could actually point out where Israel was, and you could see how little it was compared to all the other land. Of the land that God promised them they could have if they walked it and possessed it. I knew that it was a large amount, but I started researching recently to see how much land did they really give up because they didn't walk it and they didn't possess it. They got tired and they had land. If they had possessed it back then, in 1948, when Israel became a nation, Israel would have gone clear out into half of what we know as Iraq, which used to be called Babylonia. 2/3 or a third of Syria, and a whole bunch of Arabia. The square miles that they possessed were 30,000. 30,000 square miles. The number of square miles that God promised them, if they would have walked on it and possessed it, would have taken them to the Euphrates River. And that is 300,000 square miles. So they occupied then and now only 10% of what they were given. To the land of the Canaanites, that's basically Israel. And to Lebanon, that's a whole other country. And as far, because to go to Lebanon, you're going east, so, and continue on east to the Euphrates River. See, I have set the land before you. Enter and take possession of the land the Lord swore to give to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their descendants after them. The land was given to the Jews who are now alive today, but they don't have it because it was not taken by their ancestors. Verse 9, he's talking about now how he consulted the leaders of each tribe. By now, enough years have gone by that the Bible refers to them as being as numerous as the stars of the sky. Remember, that promise was made to Abraham. It was renewed to Isaac, and it was renewed to Jacob. I said to you at the time, I can't bear the responsibility for you on my own. This is Moses talking to the people. Your God has so multiplied you today that you are as numerous as the stars of the sky. May the Lord, the God of your fathers, increase you 1,000 times more. You are huge. May you become even bigger. Increase 1,000 times more and bless you as he promised you. But now Moses is saying, you have so many problems, I can't deal with you. Verse 12, he says, how can I bear your troubles, burdens, and disputes by myself? This is very similar to what happens in the book of Judges. See, they had the law. So it wasn't a matter of what should we do and what should we not do. It was a matter of a judge listening to the story, seeing what part of the law was involved, and making a decision. Well, we have Moses doing something similar here. Moses is the one leader. His brother Aaron has died off. Of course, Aaron's son is now the high priest, but this kid doesn't have the background that his father, Moses' brother, had. He said, so appoint for yourself people that are wise and understanding and respected from each tribe, and I will make them your leaders. And he said, do what you think is good. So he took the leaders of the tribes and he said, okay, you are over so many people, you are over so many people, you are over so many people. Judge rightly between a man and his brother or a foreign resident. Foreign residents were allowed as long as they practiced the law of God. Do not show partiality when rendering judgment. Listen to small and great alike. Important person, people who weren't important. Don't be intimidated by anybody. And bring to me any case that's too difficult for you, and I will hear it. Now we go to verse 19. We're still in the first chapter of Deuteronomy. And Moses is reminding them about their problems because they didn't go into Kadesh Barnea and into the promised land when they were supposed to. We then set out from Horeb and went across the great and terrible wilderness you saw in the hill country of the Amorites. Desert. Just as the Lord our God had commanded. When we reached Kadesh Barnea, I said to you, see, he's reminding them of the history. Some of them, all of them were under 20 at the time it happened. I said to you, you've reached the hill country, which the Lord is giving us. And I told you, go in and take possession. Do not be afraid and do not be discouraged. All of you approached me. Well, actually, it was their parents. And they said, let's send men ahead of us. And he's explaining to them, your parents wanted us to send spies and find out what the land was like and come back and tell us and then vote. See, that wasn't necessary because God already told them what to do. They didn't need to come to a decision, whether it was a good deal or a bad deal. God already said, it's a good deal, go in. This is my plan for you. And they refused. See, he said, it seemed good to me when everybody said, let's send spies. He had no way of knowing what the idea of sending spies was not bad. What was bad was after the spies came back and told the people that, no, we can't do it. And the people believed the spies and didn't go. That was the problem, not sending the spies. Of course, if they really all trusted the Lord, they wouldn't have had the idea of sending the spies anyway. So they sent so much from each tribe. They took fruit from the land and they carried it down to us. And verse 26, but you, or your parents really, were not willing to go up. So you rebelled against God's command. You grumbled in your tents. Each one of you went with your own family and you complained. And you said, the Lord brought us out of Egypt and now we're going to die in the hands of the Amorites. Well, if it wasn't the Amorites, it was somebody else. They were always saying we were better off. Yeah, we were better off when we were slaves. We worked 16 hours a day. We had a handful of bread and a little bit of water. The boy babies were being killed as Moses was put in a little basket. He didn't get killed, but most of them did. But they kept, we have a tendency to say the old days were good, and they were. I have wonderful memories of when I lived in a house and didn't have a refrigerator. We had an ice box, and you had to put a pan under the ice box, and the water went in, and you had to empty it. If you didn't empty it, the pan overflowed, and you had water. But I still think of the good old days, and I have good memories. But some of my memories was the icebox overflowing. Some of my better memories was when the ice truck came, and they would take an ice pick because they came in 100 pounds. Most people bought 25 pounds, a few bought 50 pounds, and so they had ice picks, and they cut it up into 25 pounds. And in all of that, you had little ice chips, and we would follow the truck, and when they would take big hunks of ice in people's refrigerator ice boxes, we would scoop up. I guess we just call it ice chips now. You, you buy it in a bag now for $3 in the supermarket. We just scooped it up, and that was just like an ice cream truck. We talk about the good old days, but they weren't all that great. I remember during the Second World War, because I lived near a large city, Detroit, and Japan did not have the ability to know what was, when they flew over a place, what was below. They didn't know if they were over a desert or over a city. So we had to practice living sometimes at night with our lights out and blankets over our windows. But I look back and I still think about the good old days. Well, I had good friends. I was young. Everything was exciting to me. I loved school. And they were good old days. I sure walked a lot to get to school and to get back, but nobody drove me. But they were the good old days. Were they really the good old days? I don't know. What do you think, Granny? Okay. So you weren't willing to go with the command of the Lord. Our brothers have discouraged us. Verse 29. So I said to you, don't be terrified or afraid. The Lord your God goes before you, and he will fight for you, just as you saw him do in Egypt. You think he's going to get you out of Egypt and then let you die somewhere else? And you saw, or their parents did, in the wilderness how the Lord your God carried you as a man carries his son. God took care of you, just like fathers take care of their kids. But in spite of this, you didn't trust the Lord. This is kind of a revival meeting type preaching. Trust God. Follow him. This is what you need to do in the future. But I'm telling you, this is not what your parents did in the past. They went before you on a journey to seek out a place for you to camp. He went in by the fire at night and the cloud by day to guide you. And he's reminding them. They're out in the middle of the desert. You burn up in the daytime. You freeze to death at night. That's how deserts are. When the Lord heard your words, or those of your parents, he said, none of these men in this evil generation will see the good I swore to give your fathers. I promised them a promised land. And I'm going to give you a promised land. But because they didn't accept it when I first offered it to them, they're not going to get it. Their children will, their grandchildren, their great grandchildren will. But they're the ones that didn't trust God, so they're not going to get it, except Caleb and Joshua. And he said, he will see it, and I will give him and his descendants the land on which he set foot, because he followed the Lord completely. He's talking about Joshua and Caleb, the two spies out of the 12, who said, yeah, it's a great place and God's with us. Let's go. Of the two, Joshua, and the next book we study after Deuteronomy is the book of Joshua. Joshua, of the two, Joshua and Caleb, becomes a leader. Caleb is given, which we will see later on, a very nice piece of land for him and his descendants. But remember, they're the only two of that generation that are going into the promised land. And the Lord, Moses is still talking to the people. He says, the Lord was angry with me because of you. You will not enter there either. Joshua, who attends you, will enter. Encourage him, for he will enable Israel to inherit it. Trust Joshua. Do what he says. He's going to be your leader. He's going to take you places that I couldn't take your parents. So, says Moses, we traveled along the road to the wilderness of Moab. That's where he's writing this from. Moab is east of Jordan, of the river. It is very close to where Jordan is now, the country of Jordan. So Moses says to the people, the Lord told me, show no hostility toward Moab. And Moab was not very nice to them. They had asked to go through before. They said, all we want is permission to walk across your country. We won't eat. If we see anything growing, we won't pull an apple off the tree. We won't pull an ear of corn off the stalk. All we want to do is walk through. We will either bring our own food and water, or we will buy from you. But we don't want any favors except just walking around Moab when let them. So now he's telling them, show no hostility toward Moab. And don't provoke them to battle, for I will not give you any of their land as a possession. The land of Moab, God was going to give to somebody else. So he said, don't try to battle and fight and have a war and win, because that's not my plan. Verse 13, the Lord said, now get up and cross the Zered Valley. It had been 38 years since the entire generation of fighting men had perished from the camp. Remember when we were studying this, that the men had to be a certain age to be among the fighting men, and then at a certain age they could no longer be among the fighting men. They could no longer be members of the military. He said, indeed, the Lord's hand was against them to eliminate them from the camp until they all perished. Now in verse 16, by the way, we're in the second chapter. And it's the first 3 chapters that he's reminding them of their history. And I'm looking at the time over here on the video, and I'm seeing I better hurry up if I'm going to get 3 chapters on the video. Today you're going to cross the border of Moab at Ar. A-R, that's the name of the place where you're going to cross Moab. When you get close to the Ammonites, don't show hostility, don't fight with them, for I will not give you their land as a possession. There will be places I will send you, and I will say, go to war, and you'll win the war, and the land will be yours. But he's saying, no, don't do it in Moab, because that's not my will. That's not my plan. I have given it as a possession to the descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew. This too used to be regarded as the land of Rephaim. He lived there before the Ammonites did. It's a great numerous people, tall people. So the Lord drove them out and settled in their place. This was just as he did for the descendants of Esau who lived in Mount Seir. Seir in history, which hasn't happened yet in our study, this 3rd trip through the Bible. But what we're going to learn in the future, Seir will be an enemy of Israel. Moab, the son of Lot, will be an enemy of Israel. So when he destroyed the Horites before them, he drove them out, and they lived in their place till now. Now we go to the defeat of some other places. In verse 25, today I will begin to put the fear and dread of you on the people everywhere under heaven. And just exactly, what does that mean? News of how I bless you. News of how I protect you. News of if I say, I'm going to give you something, it's going to be yours. If I send you to war, you're going to win. That news is going to spread throughout the whole world. They will hear the report about you and tremble and be in anguish because of you. This news is going to be around the world, and people are not going to want to mess with you. So I sent messages with offers of peace to the king. And I said in verse 27, let us travel through your land. We will keep strictly to the highway. We will not turn to the right or to the left. You can sell us food in exchange of silver so we can eat. We got money. We got silver. We'll give you silver. You give us food. But we'll buy. We don't want a gift. And give us water for silver so we can drink. We'll even buy the water we drink. Just as the descendants of Esau who lived in Seir did for us. We went through Seir, that's what we did. We spent our money, we bought food, we bought water. We were not a burden on anybody. Until we cross the Jordan into the land the Lord our God has given us. We're not going to be a burden on anybody. We'll buy our way. Where'd they get all this money? Where'd they get all the silver that they're using to buy stuff? I mean, you see, every time they went to war and won, all the soldiers fighting against them died. When somebody died in a war, anything they owned then became, it's known by a number of different names. Booty is one name. I jokingly say, even the silver in your teeth If anybody was wearing a garment that wasn't all bloodied and the fabric was good, that was put in the booty or the spoil. If the people had a good sword, that went into the spoil. Whatever the people who are now dead once owned went into the spoil. So they won many battles. They got many sheep, much cattle. And that's one of the ways God blessed them also, in that their cattle had large groups of offspring. So they were blessed that way. But then they were blessed when they won a war with everything that the people that they fought against once owned now became theirs. That's one of the ways they became very wealthy. But the king of Heshbon would not let us travel through the land. For the Lord your God made his spirit stubborn in order to hand him over to you. The Lord allowed this guy to be stubborn so that you'd have a battle with him, and so you'd win. And the Lord said to me, this is Moses talking to the people. The Lord said to me, I've begun to give Shihan and the land to you. Begin to take possession of it. It's yours. So the whole army came out against us for the battle at Jahaz. The Lord our God handed him over to us, and we defeated him, his sons, his whole army. We captured his cities. We destroyed the people, including women and children. We left no survivors. This sounds ungodlike. And we talked recently, I think it was on a Sunday, because we were talking about the New Testament, of Jesus cleansing the temple. You have to not only encourage the godly, you've got to get rid of the ungodly sometime, or the ungodly will turn the godly into ungodly. We took only the livestock and spoil from the cities we captured as a plunder for ourselves. There was no city inaccessible to us. No such thing as a wall too high or an army too strong. Now we go to chapter 3. And they're talking about the king of Bashan. Bashan is north of the cities I've already mentioned, or the countries, Moab, Seir. Bashan is even north of that. The Lord said, don't fear him. I've handed him over to you along with the whole army. Whatever you do, you're going to win. If you do nothing, you're going to win. So the Lord our God handed over Og, king of Bashan, and his whole army to us. And we struck them until there was no survivors left. There wasn't a city we didn't take from them. 60 cities, the entire region, the kingdom of Og and Bashan. These had fortified high walls. We've discussed in the past why cities had to have high walls to protect the people and the property within the walls. There were gates that were open so the citizens could go in and out, but at night they were closed. And I'm looking over here, it's off camera, but I had drawn the Eye of the Needle, which was a little door within the main gate of the city that could be opened at night if a citizen got back after dark when the gates were closed. He talked about the land of the Transjordan tribes. He said, remember that I believe it was last week we talked about 2½ tribes asked Moses, and Moses asked God if these 2½ tribes could live outside of the promised land. And the reason they wanted to live outside, they hadn't gotten in the promised land yet, but they were on the other side of the Jordan River from it. And they saw the grass, and they saw that it was perfect for the kind of herds that they had. And they asked if they could live there. And Moses asked God, and the answer was yes, but you're going to fight to liberate and to get the Jews into the promised land. You're not going to say, well, we're going to live out here. We're going to put our kids and our wives here, and we're here. We will not go into the promised land. They were told, you can live out there eventually. And your wives and kids can live out there now. But the men are going to fight along with all the other men to take over the promised land. And that was Reuben and Gad and half a tribe of Manasseh. In verse 18 it says, I command you, the Lord has given you this land to possess, not to just walk through, but to possess. All your fighting men will cross over in battle formation of your brothers. Your wives and young children and livestock, they can remain back until the Lord gives rest to your brothers, the other men, when they no longer are fighting for the land. Then you go back and live in the green grass with your cattle if you want to. But until then, you're here fighting. Now, I'm almost through. I commanded Joshua and said, your own eyes have seen everything. Don't be afraid. God fights for you. At that time, I begged the Lord, please let me cross over and see the beautiful land on the other side of Jordan. God already told him. He could go to a high mountain. He could look. He could see it. But he couldn't cross the Jordan River and actually walk on it. But, you know, I would have done the same thing. So would you. Your parents say no, and you really want something, and you say, can I? Even though your parents have already said no. But the Lord was angry with me, and on that account would not listen to me. And he said, that's enough. Don't speak to me on this matter again. But commission Joshua and encourage and strengthen him, for he will cross over ahead of the people and enable them to inherit the land. And that ends the 3rd chapter. And I've got 1 minute left, I think, on this video. So see you on the next video.